The welfare state. This is the greatest advance in our history. From now on, Beveridge is not the name of a man, it is the name of a way of life, and not only for Britain, but for the whole civilized world. What is the UK's most important institution? A non-British person might answer Parliament, the Civil Service, the Church of England, the monarchy, or even the BBC. But the average Briton would say the NHS, National Health Service. Whatever its failings, it is the institution that the British love above all others. The NHS dates from July 1948. The work of Clement Attlee's Labour government in creating it and setting up the welfare state is a defining event in modern British history. State-run services in health, education, housing, social security and pensions today take up about 2/3 of all government spending. At the start of the 20th century, none of these were provided by the state, except schooling up to age 12, but all that changed after the Second World War. Governments of the Victorian era had a harsh attitude towards welfare. They feared that the poor would become dependent on government help instead of helping themselves. Local authorities ran workhouses for the poor, but their aim was as much to punish or deter poverty as to offer relief. They provided only the most basic support for those who simply could not survive on their own, the deserving poor. The Victorians saw no reason for the state to take responsibility for the health or well-being of the undeserving poor. In the years before the First World War, Herbert Asquith's Liberal government felt the need to respond to the needs of an advanced industrial society. It included the radical Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, and the young Winston Churchill, who, with certain other members of the cabinet, came to be known as the New Liberals. These men created the first ever state-funded old-age pensions, as well as national insurance schemes, to cover some workers against sickness and unemployment. While they arguably laid the foundations for the welfare state, they provided no more than a means-tested safety net for the most vulnerable. But traditional thinking about welfare changed totally with the Second World War. It was the first People's War, and the key role played by civilians produced a social revolution. The economist Sir William Beveridge is recognized as the founding father of the welfare state. His 1942 report was very much a product of its extraordinary times. Its aim was to look into existing social insurance arrangements and make recommendations for the future. Announcing his findings, he stated, "The purpose of victory is to live in a better world than the old world." He boldly claimed that the welfare state would slay 5 giant evils: want, disease, squalor, ignorance, and idleness. There was an ecstatic public response to the Beveridge report. One newspaper proclaimed that it would provide for people's vital needs from the cradle to the grave. The NHS was the centerpiece of Beveridge's scheme. Labour's formidable Health Secretary, Aneurin Bevan, was responsible for the detailed planning behind it. He met strong opposition from Britain's leading doctors, who were concerned about losing their independence and becoming state employees. In the end, Bevan effectively bought their support. "I stuffed their mouths with gold," he said. But the main beneficiaries of this bribery were the millions who until July 1948 were unable to afford basic treatment. In the first year of the NHS, for example, more than 8 million pairs of free spectacles were ordered. The post-war Labour government was also the first to commit itself to full employment. Social insurance became comprehensive rather than selective. Compulsory contributions to a national insurance scheme provided for incomes during sickness, unemployment, widowhood and retirement. There were child benefits and income support. For the first time, there was free secondary education for all. The government also began a massive house-building program to deal with the homelessness caused by bomb damage. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, there was cross-party consensus on the welfare state. Then, in the 1970s, right-wing politicians began to challenge this. As Margaret Thatcher stated, they were eager to roll back the frontiers of the state. Their arguments, together with rising unemployment, raised concerns over costs and a dependency culture. The election of Thatcher in 1979 put the very future of the welfare state in question. Her Conservative government sold over 1 million council houses to their tenants, and grew bolder in its approach after a third consecutive election victory in 1987. State education and the NHS continued, but there were increased state subsidies to the private alternatives. In addition, the Conservatives broke the link between pensions and earnings and cut the value of benefits to the unemployed. There was also a move towards a US-style workfare system, under which the unemployed lost the right to refuse jobs offered to them. Tony Blair's Labour government briefly promised profound changes to the welfare state after its massive victory in 1997. Blair delighted in challenging his own party's sacred cows and instructed one of his ministers, Frank Field, to think the unthinkable on welfare reform. He did not get very far. Powerful opposition from his more traditional colleagues forced Field out of office after about a year. Despite the Prime Minister's wishes, the message could not be clearer. There would be little thinking on welfare issues. Having set tough reforming standards, Blair clearly regretted the modesty of his government's record on welfare reform. The welfare state was still too obviously Beveridge's creation when he left office in June 2007. Although many British people were relieved about this, the coalition government created in 2010 made simplifying the system of welfare payments a key priority. Its aim was to ensure that no one could receive more money from benefits than they could from working.